Hello everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to this latest Mills Reeve's Foundations webinar on the challenges of and preparing for the expiry of private finance initiative contracts and the transfer of assets and services back to the public sector or another private sector body. This webinar will tell you what you need to know, whether you're in the public or private sector, about this complex PFI expiry process and managing the many risks that await anyone who is not fully prepared for expiry. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Martino Giaquinto, and I'm a construction partner with the privilege of leading M&R's construction, engineering and energy disputes practice, and I shall be your host for today's talk. But the real work is being done by one of our busy and experienced commercial projects lawyers within the team. So let me introduce you to our key speaker, being Mark Hanlon. Mark is a senior principal associate in our commercial projects and construction team, having advised on the intricacies and complexities of PFI and infrastructure projects in various sectors like health, roads, schools and rail for over 2 decades. Mark's approach and outlook as a specialist commercial PFI lawyer is assisted by the fact that, as well as working in private practice as a commercial lawyer, he has for many years been in-house counsel for a major UK Tier 1 contractor heavily involved in PFI. He has advised equity investors closing approximately 25 PFI PPP deals in that capacity, including on 2 of the biggest PFI PPP deals in the market, Metronet and M25. He has advised on bids and also on operational deals on the construction and FM side. Further, he has worked in a government department and co-located with a London borough for 4 years on its PFI schools programme, responsible for PFI projects. As such, Mark has an invaluable perspective on this dense subject matter, having seen it from many sides. Mark's talk will discuss in some detail the key provisions and timeframes relevant to the PFI contract expiry process in the UK and how to implement an effective and purposeful PFI expiry plan, and will offer some practical tips and observations based on his extensive experience. We expect Mark will talk for about 45 minutes. This will then be followed by a Q&A session, so please do submit any questions you have during this session by using the Q&A box on your screen. A recording of the session is taking place and will be sent to you afterwards, along with a copy of the slides. So, with those few words of introduction, let's make a start. I'll now hand you over to Mark. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Martino, and thank you for everybody who has joined. I hope this is a very useful and informative session for you. And I hope not to scare you too much with some of the things which is in here. The basis of this talk is a document that was published by the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, the IPA, as we will call it. It published guidance back in on the 28th of February 2022. As I go through the slides, you'll notice there are some sections of the slides that are in bold and some sections of the slides that are not in bold. The bold sections are the points which are the important points which I can fit into the 40-odd minutes that I've got. But the unbolded sections are the points of detail, which when you look at the slides, you can see. What the slides are attempting to do is summarize what is a 70-odd page report from the IPA. So you don't have to go and read the whole 70 pages. Hopefully you can just look at the slides for the key points which are in bold, or if you want more detail, there's more detail in the slides. So that's just a little bit of background to how this talk's going to go. So you'll see that I jumped through the slides quite quickly for some sections which are points of detail, but you can look into later if you wish. New PFI deals were substantial from the late 1990s to the early 2010s. As Martino said, they covered a wide variety of sectors, which I've listed on the slides there, like health, roads, schools, street lighting. It was everywhere. PFI was introduced for three main reasons. There were plenty of others, but it was introduced for three main reasons. Conventional procurement up to that point had seen time and delivery risk go back to the taxpayer. So if a project was badly specified, or it went over budget, or it was late, many of those risks came back to the taxpayer, which was perceived to be very bad value for money for the taxpayer. PFI was introduced in significant part to deal with that. I seem to remember that the Jubilee Line extension in England and the Scottish Parliament procurement north of the border were two key, in some respects, perceived to be failed procurement models, which did make both governments look at alternatives, and PFI was one of the alternatives it was an alternative they came up with. So PFI was intended to fix that problem by transferring time and delivery risk to the private sector, so that those would not, on balance, be public sector risks. Also, the construction cost of the new asset, an NHS hospital, schools, roads, the construction cost of that generally would appear on the public sector borrowing requirement. The PFI programme was extensive, and the government did not want the capital cost of these projects to appear on the public sector balance sheet. So, as if by magic, a quarter of the NHS hospital stock, which is a figure I have in my mind, I don't know if it's accurate, but it's a figure that I remember from the time. For instance, a quarter of the NHS hospital stock was replaced without it going on the public sector balance sheet. The early 1990s were a tough time for the public sector balance sheet. As we have seen from recent events, the markets can get spooked by a large PSBR. So PFI was an attempt to get infrastructure spending without spooking the markets. It was fairly successful in that. Also, on a lot of conventionally procured projects, the assets might have been nice and gleaming on day one, but through a poor maintenance regime, it could go to rack and ruin. The intention of PFI was to maintain a world asset maintenance program, a world-leading asset maintenance program, so that the assets came back to the public sector at the end of the contract term in pretty much the same condition that they were at the start of it. And so that was meant to sort of vastly improve the experience of people who use public services, because these are all public service assets at the end of the day. Since then, PFI has fallen out of favour for a number of reasons that we won't go into. What I will give throughout the talk is the example of a standard NHS PFI hospital, but it covers many sectors. So we might not be a hospital, might be a road, might be street lighting, but I'll use the standard example of an NHS PFI hospital. The way that PFI worked was the NHS needed a new hospital. Private sector came along, borrowed money off senior lenders and equity lenders, built the asset, and then operated the building or the road or whatever it was over a course of 20 to 30 years, and then that goes back. And the public sector paid what was a unitary charge, which was effectively a mortgage payment that paid off the debt that the private sector had borrowed to build the asset and paid for the maintenance of the asset over the course of the contract period. Now, the issue that we're dealing with today is the third bullet point, it's sub-bullet point there, the standard in which the asset will come back and what the services in respect of maintaining that asset will look like on day one post-expiry. So PFI had a number of successes, but it was ultimately perceived to be a failure. The projects were over a 20 to 30 year term. Now, I gave the date of the 1990s. So doing simple arithmetic, you will be able to see that in the 2020s, those projects are actually coming to the end of their contract term. The issue at question is the condition of the assets going back to the public sector and the provision of the services day one after contract expiry. The IPA says this is a huge challenge, and it's an issue which is not years away. It's an issue which is galloping down the track very, very quickly, and early planning is therefore recommended. The IPA guidance is, quote, not prescriptive. It is a, quote, framework. This is a very, very important point that I'll come on to. I'll give you a number of cliffhangers as we go along, just to keep interest going. But this is a key point that I will come back to, that I do think it introduces a number of the challenges in this whole process. There's about 550 PFI contracts in England, over 700 in the UK in total. The IPA guidance covers England at the moment. The National Audit Office has found that the public sector are underestimating time resource and complexity in managing the end of these contracts. One point to make at the very start of this, although this talk might appear to be very public sector orientated, it isn't. The private sector will have to be involved in this process to a very, very considerable degree, but the onus of compliance is on the public sector to begin with. But it's if you're in the private sector, do expect a knock at the door if you're working on an operational project when it's coming up to expiry. What's the expiry profile over the coming years? Well, I hope you can see this, but I'll run through the key points. This is the graph of the expiry profile for the 550 contracts in England. It does not include the other 150 or so in the rest of the UK. You might think, well, hang on a minute, there's hardly anything going on in 22. There's less than 10 contracts expiring. There isn't much going on for the rest of the decade until you get to about 2026, 2027, 2028. This is years away. We can see an expiry profile really ramping up in the 2030s of 50 expiries a year. That's about one a week. If you break it down into how do 50 expiries play across a 52-week year, that is a considerable number, but it is not yet. Well, a key issue. The IPA recommends that the expiry process starts 7 years before actual contract expiry. Why? PFI is considered to be more complex than a standard outsourcing, which then has to go back to the public sector. In Appendix 1 to these slides, I've set out what the IPA recommends should happen in each of these 7 years prior to expiry, what the key date milestones are. But please keep that 7-year figure in your head. It's one of the key points. So projects which expire between 2022 and 2029, obviously we're almost into 2023, so that will go to 2030. Projects in that window should be starting their expiry process now. So if you've got a project which is expiring in 2030, you don't need to start. The message is don't worry about it in 2030. 2030 in expiry terms has to start now. From the table, therefore, I estimate that there's about 120 projects expiring within that somewhere in that 7-year expiry window. So that is actually probably a bigger profile than people might have been expecting, and that is something which is simply going to ramp up year on year. But the key point, if you've got a project which is expiring in the next 7 years or around about 2030, then the IPA is recommending action starts now. If your project is expiring later than that, obviously this information is going to be very, very relevant when that time comes. You don't have to start 7 years before expiry. It would be very worthwhile thinking about these issues now and doing any forward planning that you can. So obviously the table which we've just given is for England. There will also be some in the rest of the UK, which while we're waiting for, I haven't yet seen if there's any guidance come from the devolved authorities. But nevertheless, there's other projects in different parts of the UK that could well be in that sort of 7-year expiry window. The IPA provides a support service and will engage with the public sector to conduct health checks on the expiry process. It's known as the Assurance Action Review, AAR. One of the key questions of this is to what extent the Treasury and government is going to mark everybody's homework in terms of where they are on the expiry process. We've said so far that this is guidance. It's not prescriptive, but I think that there is a fundamental question which will be answered over the next couple of years as to whether something which is currently considered to be guidance and might be considered by some to be a bit of a wish list, whether that actually becomes much harder and a much harder compliance obligation. That may happen if the expiry of PFI contracts is considered to be a political risk going forward. To use a very, very crude example, could that happen? Could there be concern over whether our hypothetical NHS PFI hospital, whether anybody can turn the heating on, whether a crucial piece of software which is required to operate a building management system, whether actually that is not available day one after expiry? And there are huge operational issues in PFI contracts that have expired. that could become a political risk with screaming headlines. I think if it does, I think the government may have a much more hands-on approach than they're currently having, but it is important to bear in mind that they're already marking public authorities' homework. So they have produced a report, which is an analysis of 52 projects in the expiry process, and a mark is given depending on the level of readiness. So red for we're worried, amber for we're a little bit worried, green for this is quite good so far. But projects expiring close to 2024 are more in the red category. And this shows that the closer a project gets to expiry, the worse marks it gets. It goes into the red category of we're worried about this, we're worried that the public authority is not ready to conclude this expiry process. And so the four key problems have been identified. A lack of understanding on the part of the public sector of how the projects work, an access to information, a lack of access to the right people with the right skills, and a lack of an understanding of the expiry process and the expected asset condition of PFI stock. I did hear one NHS estate manager say once, "Well, I've got a lot of hospital stock. I'm worried about the public sector stock. I'm not worried about my PFI hospital because it's in better condition than the rest. And if that comes back to me in that condition, I'm perfectly happy." That's actually an approach that the IPA recommends is not taken, for the simple reason that the PFI asset might not be currently being maintained to its current standard. And so they recommend that a deep dive is done to the contracts to ascertain what standard that should come back in. Now, another key issue, PFI is complex, and the IPA recommends that the expiry process is not business as usual. So the teams which are currently managing the operation of the projects should be involved in expiry, but they should not be the teams conducting the expiry process, because expiry is regarded as a full-time job that's going to require a new dedicated team to do it, and is going to require senior management buy-in given the nature of some of the decisions that have got to be taken. That, again, that is a key point to take away in terms of considering resourcing requirements. Get it wrong, and there is a risk of operational disruption, lack of service continuity, the kind of example I just gave, can we turn the heating on? Risk transfer, for instance, there may be considerable risks transferring back, for instance, legislative and health and safety compliance, which go back to the public sector that it may not be familiar with, financial loss and reputational damage, and a rush at the end, because thus far there hasn't been adequate consideration of the issues that are involved. The point that I touched on earlier about an asset going back in substandard condition, this is something which the IPA is very concerned about, because it takes the view that the taxpayer has already paid for that asset to be maintained to a contractual standard through the course of the contract. If it hasn't been, and it then comes back to the public sector, and then post-contract expiry must be brought up to the right condition, the taxpayer will have effectively paid twice. And again, this comes straight into our basket of political risks, which the government might be worried about, that the taxpayer will be paying twice for a job that should have been done the first time around. So that is a key worry of the government. Now, we come on to the cliff edge nature of expiry date. When we were negotiating these deals, we were all very, very busy, and there wasn't enough people to do them. But the way that we closed them in effectively the order that we could do them. Public authorities said, I want my deal to close in March 2003. We didn't have the people to do it. We were already closing a deal in March 2003. We say, I'm awfully sorry, we can't do it in March 2003. We'll do it in a couple of months' time. And often that's simply what happened. There were very few projects that had a firm requirement for a contract signature date beyond which there was a problem if it didn't happen. Most of them were in practice were extendable in terms of when we reach contract signature. That enabled us to manage resourcing issues. We don't have that luxury on expiry. The contract state that the contract will expire 30 years or 20 years or 25 years or 40 years after the date of financial close, which is effectively when it was signed and the contract became live. That cliff edge nature of expiry is a big problem. I'm going to come on to, can that be extended? And the simple answer at the moment is probably not. This poses to it. There are now three big issues which should be emerging in the course of this talk. The first is that there isn't a prescriptive way to do this. The government is not saying, as it was when we were closing these deals, here's a form of contract, you've got to do it on this form of contract. And we all said, yes, okay, we'll do it on this form of contract, but with a few project specifics where we'd have to negotiate something. This is a green field. There is no prescriptive way to do this. The government is not saying, here's a model that you follow for expiry, and all PFI expiries across the country will be done this way, and you don't have to worry about it. There's a lot of thinking that's got to be done. That is coupled with a very, what will be a very busy market in which there will be a scramble for resource and talent against the clock ticking of a cliff edge expiry date. So you've got three problems. The public sector, as very early in the process, needs to consider the changes it needs to service delivery. Service delivery here is effectively maintaining the asset and the assets that it needs. The public sector needs to be clear what it wants, and it needs to have time to implement changes. The public sector will have spent years separated from the actual service delivery. So to take our standard PFI hospital, the NHS Trust will have a project agreement with an SPV, which is just essentially a debt vehicle that does a little bit of management. But the service that contract will contain obligations in respect of performing the building management services. There'll be a subcontract from the project company down to an FM contractor, and one deal that was in the expiry process recently that had 50 subcontracts beneath the FM contract, and this is in respect of provision of services to the NHS. So you can see straight away that there is a considerable separation between where the NHS is sitting and contractually where the obligations are and where the know-how is in terms of how these services are going to be performed. Some of the projects also, so our hypothetical NHS Trust, or it could be any public authority, will have a lack of visibility of what services are coming back to it. There could also be very, very bad relationships. Some projects have succeeded and are going very well. Others have got their problems. And the IPA is saying it's going to be very, very hard to manage an expiry profile where there are existing bad relationships. So a relationship clean slate is recommended. If the services are not taken back in-house, the public sector is going to have to run a procurement and a contract negotiating exercise to transfer the building maintenance services from the existing facilities management contractor to a new one. This could introduce some really complex issues of dual running. The services that the authority might want post-expiry might be very different from the services it's currently getting, but it will not be possible without a contract variation to change the services that it's getting. So there could be some very, very complex interfaces with dual running between two sets of services in respect of the same asset. Time also might be needed to implement any capital expenditure works on the asset. As I said, the IPA doesn't recommend an SOPC4, that's a standard form contract mandatory approach. There's no one-size-fits-all prescriptive solution. It's a greenfield approach for every project in terms of what the authority wants to get back and what kind of services the authority wants post-expiry. Three possible models. The public sector takes the asset and the services back in-house, or the public sector lets the services to a new services contractor. So there's procurement law issues and contract negotiation going to be required, all against ticking clock cliff edge expiry date. It could extend the PFI. Well, isn't that easier than what we're hearing now? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The IPA is against this, and this effectively means the government is against this. The end is the end. They don't want PFI contracts being extended. They don't want them being extended beyond the expiry date for a short period. They don't want them extended for an indefinite period. If a particular public authority says, I want to extend my PFI, the government's attitude is, we don't want you to do that. Now, will this hold water? We all know that U-turns can be common politically, and I do wonder whether the IPA can actually maintain this position going forward. We shall have to see, but that is currently the position as it stands now. So in reality, only bullet points 1 and 2 there. It's back in-house or a new service provider are currently the only options on the table. Now, just to turn to well, this is all that. So I've outlined all the problems. How do we deal with this? What is the IPA recommending in terms of an approach to dealing with some of the issues that we've discussed? Well, the first one is expiry cannot be regarded as business as usual. It's too big. You need a new team to manage this. The authority's got to produce a resource plan. That involves documentation and contract reviews. The IPA recommends that, and also it's sorry, I was jumping ahead of myself there. Another reason why the IPA wants the expiry process to start early is that 7 years before expiry, the original project funders are still likely to be involved. They will disappear a few years before expiry because the debt will be paid back. But in the 7 year at the start of the 7 year window, they should still be there. One of the points that the IPA makes is that an awful lot of public sector entities don't either understand their contracts properly or they're not enforcing them properly. This is going to become an issue when it comes to expiry because various reserves that can be built up to either to get the asset in the condition that it needs to be when it goes back, they're not being built up properly as they should be. There may also be ways in which the public sector can actually get money out of the private sector through deductions and various financial sharing mechanisms, where the public authority might be able to build up a pot of money for a rainy day if it all goes wrong. So the IPA is saying also start your expiry process early so you can understand your contract and you can leave your project funders to put pressure on Project Code to perform its obligations. Because if obligations are not being met now, it's going to be very, very hard to get the project company to actually start to meet its obligations the closer we get to expiry. It's going to have less and less of an interest in this because it will just want to exit if it's got no future. So how to implement a PFI expiry? The IPA says all parties, so not just the public sector, all parties need to understand when expiry is and the milestones along the way, rights they need to land, assets and information after contract expiry, processes around handover, that's handover of the assets back to the public sector, the required condition of those assets, and also the disclosure of information that might need to be done to any new service provider. Therefore, a public sector authority, but actually include the private sector in this because the private sector is going to be involved in this, should obtain all PFI contract documentation, undertake a legal review of these, create document and contract registers, understand the expiry provisions and assess if they're accurate, create a risk register and gaps list, and understand the risks and uncertainties around the expiry process. The IPA recommends a clause-by-clause review. It says the project agreement, but actually it's everything. I've just referred to the example of that project where there was 50 subcontracts to the FM contract. All those are going to need to be looked at because they're relevant to what is coming back to the public authority and the authority understanding the services which it's currently getting and how its asset operates. The IPA says this is not a selective review. It recommends a whole contract review so that issues like intellectual property rights, information obligations, they're properly assessed because they will be scattered all across the project documents. A key issue for the authority is going to be getting the information it needs on the services that are being provided to it. So it needs to understand its information rights right across the suite of the contracts. It needs to understand if there's any software it needs, if there's any intellectual property licenses it needs, all of that fun stuff. So that is a contract review right at the start of the 7-year process. So if your project is expiring in say 2030, that's something which really the IPA is recommending is front-ended now. One key problem is the information sharing obligations in the project agreement might be inadequate. The information that the authority needs it simply has no contractual right to get, and that is why the IPA says a clean relationship platform needs to be established with the private sector to get goodwill, to get disclosure of information which the authority needs, but it has no contractual right to get. What the IPA doesn't address is that it said, hey, create a relationship clean slate, great, but enforce your contract in a way you haven't been enforcing before. And there is a conflicting objective in that because you're saying, I want a clean relationship slate with you. I want all this information I'm not entitled to, but now I'm going to clobber you with a load of deductions that I haven't been clobbering you with up until now. There is a tension there. I've given a list of the kind of things that the public sector authority or hypothetical and NHS trust will need. Asset registers, operation and maintenance manuals, compliance reports, financial test information, condition surveys, information of insurance claim, technical reviews, a full set of variations. How many projects have got a fully documented set of variations? There's so much which has happened over the years which is not filed or recorded, and all of the information has been lost or doesn't exist. So actually getting that information, we may be losing a year just getting it all. Once that review has been done, assess the risks and the gaps. So crucial questions: who owns the asset at expiry? Is it the public sector? Is it the private sector? Does our hypothetical NHS trust have to pay anything to get its hospital back? Are the handover revisions clear in handing that hospital back? Is there enough time to do building surveys to see what condition it's in? Are the asset handover conditions clear? So, for instance, is there a contractual standard saying what's this going to come back in? At the moment, I'm doing student accommodation projects where we're saying it's got to come back to meet risk condition B. But this might not have been specified in the early deals. People were not thinking about expiry 30 years ago. They took the view, I'll be retired. So some of the early contracts might be very, very thin on all of this. Are the contractual communication provisions between the parties fit for purpose? Can you actually contractually compel someone to turn up at the meeting? So these are the kind of things which the public authority, as a result of this review, needs to compile: a gaps list, a risk register, a high-level summary, and a supporting timeline, and crucially, a key commercial strategy. So this is what we want. This is what we want to achieve, and this is how we're going to get from A to B. In Appendix 2, I've listed a summary of all the documents the IPA has recommended be created. So thoughts on information rights: use all contractual rights to get information, challenge the accuracy and completeness of data, make use of payments and performance mechanisms to incentivize performance. That effectively means if the private sector is not performing properly, cover it with payment deductions. Actively monitor implementation of maintenance plans and lifecycle renewal programs. What that basically means is there should be contractual obligations in terms of how often are we doing surveys, who's conducting those surveys, what schedule of program maintenance comes out of that, what pots of money are we building up to fund all of this? Is that happening? And then compare the actual life cycle spends with those in the model, so that the financial model is saying project companies should be spending this every year and it's not. There's clearly a problem. So a check to see if maintenance accounts are properly funded. Check to see if there's any evidence of asset underinvestment and asset deterioration. The list does go on. It's check project company's compliance with its maintenance obligations. Check its project company's financial performance. Is it paying dividends? If it's paying dividends, it's got cash. If it's not paying dividends, it hasn't got cash, in which case there's a potential problem. Check to see the sufficient operational information available. It's which staff are going to transfer back, what do their contracts look like, what building and maintenance information are needed, etc. What asset registers are needed, etc., etc. Again, as I've noted already, trigger any financial sharing arrangements that exist, like energy savings, insurance premiums, profit sharing, because the public sector may need to actually build up a pot of money, which you would get from the private sector through the public sector. Can get money back from the private sector through deductions, and there may be various gain share mechanisms in the contract, which the public sector might not be utilising. The IPA saying utilise all that so you can build up a pot of money. Also, another document, the authority should produce a relationship plan based on the parties' objectives. So the aim of all of that is to create a practical all-party route map, not just public sector, private sector as well, an all-party route map for engagement, and share with the project company to create a joint relationship management plan. So use relationship plans to start discussions early, identify contractual ambiguities, deal with tricky issues and make use of contractual DRP mechanisms to deal with issues. That is an important point. The IPA is saying if you're going to have a dispute, if both parties are going to get involved in a dispute, have a dispute. If you need to go through a dispute resolution procedure because there's a problem, do it in order to produce a resolution. If you've got to appoint a QC to get a legal opinion on what the contract means, do it. Because if those things are not thrashed out, the expiry process is not going to go properly. Long 7-year lead-in, because if works are anticipated in the 7 to 5 year in the expiry process, it needs to be clearly understood what they are. So the assets of the assets are going to be surveyed. Works are going to be planned. They then got to be carried out, and some of them might be extremely complex. So what the IPA recommends, SOPC4 and a lot of the standard form contracts said that the final expiry of the assets is 18 to 24 months before contract. The IPA has changed that position and said that it recommends the final asset survey is 5 years before expiry, so 3 years earlier than what the contract actually provides. Now, there may be no contractual right for that survey to happen in year 5. So what the IPA is recommending is that is something which the public sector is going to have to negotiate with the private sector. It may end up having to pay for the survey, or both sides may say, well, actually, we'll just bring it forward and we'll pay for it jointly because it's in both of our interests to know what's going on. But again, so if you look at your contract and it says do your final asset survey 18 to 24 months before expiry, that's no longer the position. It's actually 5 years before expiry, even though that might not be contractual. That should enable another important point. If under the contractual expiry, so 2 years before contract end, the IPA says, well, if the authority has, if life cycle pot, if pots of money have not been properly built up, if the private sector is not performing its obligations properly, there's a very, very short window in that period of time for the authority to enforce against the private sector. And again, if the survey is done in year 5, there is more time to enforce contractual compliance against the private sector. So that is another reason for front-ending this process. So I've noted that there's a green field in terms of who pays for that survey. It can be an authority survey, it could be a joint survey, it could be funded by one party, it could be funded by both. The survey is to be regarded as a critical path item. There's about 20 years plus of asset data and documentation that needs to be transferred. There's about 30 years of information that's going to have to be found from somewhere, wherever it is. Asset condition is likely to be the biggest cause of commercial tension, given the financial amounts at stake, giving rise potentially to long negotiations to sort it out and disputes. Again, the IPA is saying if you're going to have a dispute, have it, but have it in good time. Don't have it right at the very end. But it is expected that there may well be construction disputes over asset condition, especially where that is not very well defined in project agreements, which were concluded a long time ago when nobody was giving much thought to this. Once a survey is completed, allow a period for negotiation. The recommended output from the process is the production of a 5-year maintenance plan up to contract expiry. That is one outcome of the survey. So it's a 5-year plan, but actually the IPA also recommends that 5-year survey is not just 5 years up to expiry, it actually deals with asset maintenance 5 years after expiry. So our 5-year expiry before contract end covers 5 years up to expiry and is intended to cover 5 years after. So it's actually a 10-year program that should be coming out of this survey. So the authority should be considering the specific. So once the authority knows the condition of its asset, the authority should be considering what remedial works need to be done to meet contract standard, the compatibility of replacement system of existing systems with any replacements, the obsolescence of any systems that cannot be supported post expiry, access issues, and the ability of the authority to retain payments until works are completed. That because the authority might end up having to do them on its own. Agree a certification process. That's who will certify works are done. to the required standard before the asset's handed back if a project agreement doesn't have this. The certification criteria should cover works needed to meet the contractual standards, what warranties are needed, the handover of asset information is complete, and operation systems are transferred over, like operation maintenance manuals, and that there has been staff training. Key question: do the handback criteria align with the authority's future service requirements for the assets that are 20 to 30 years old? So you've got a project agreement that says the assets are going to come back in this condition, and we spend an awful lot of time making sure that the assets are brought up to the contractual condition to hand them back, only for them actually to be not applicable, for them not to be fit for purpose after contract expiry. Changes to the authority's requirements might arise due to changes in delivery methods, methodology, updates to guidance and legislation, and also new authority policies. So here's a bit of a complex one. The IPA says, do an awful lot while your funders are still there, because they will apply leverage against project company to do what it should do. Okay, fine. But if a contract variation needs to be done because the assets need to look completely different after contract expiry, a variation is going to have to be done before expiry. That's something which the public sector would probably pay for because it's an authority change. The problem is that if project funders are still around, variations are notoriously difficult because they require funder consent. And anybody who's done one will know that it can be extraordinarily hair-tearingly difficult. So we have this sort of slightly difficult situation in which do as much as you can while funders are still there so that they can put leverage on project company. But if you've got a variation, if possible, do it after funders have gone, because they're not going to cause problems with it, because they're not going to say we don't consent to that. That could be phenomenally difficult, especially if that is a very, very difficult piece of CapEx works. But nevertheless, that's one of the difficult tensions to bear in mind, and one of the things that needs to have to be carefully thought through. So the message here is, if your asset is going to come back and it meets the contract standard, but it's not what you want post expiry, you need to do a variation before the contract expires. Expiry is an all-party discussion, not just the authority. All parties should be involved from day one. The commercial strategy binds together the work on contract management, relationship management, asset knowledge, and future services preparation. The IPA recommends against contract extension. This is one of the points which I mentioned earlier. They consider it not to be value for money. It would breach procurement rules, so procurement advice will be needed. It could be hard to extend the FM contract for the rest of the PFI, so it would require a new contract. So it would be a new contract requiring a procurement competition. So a future service plan is always needed. In other words, it's very, very hard to extend your existing PFI contract. I think we've touched on establishing who holds the life cycle fund and whether this, who's got the money which is going to fund the works to bring the assets up to standard. And we've touched on also resolving any legacy issues before negotiations start. So we've got that relationship clean slate. On expiry of the PFI contract, I think there's two issues. The IPA is saying we don't want this. We don't want it extended in place of expiry. We want it to expire, and there are procurement issues in doing that. So currently, that is a no-no unless the government changes its mind. The second issue is whether there should be expiry, because we're almost ready. That there should be an extension to the PFI contract, because we've got this fixed expiry date. We're almost ready, but we're not quite ready. We need another 3 months. Can't we just have a one-page deed of variation extending the contract? Again, the answer to that appears to be no at this point, and that appears to be a procurement law issue. And I obviously can't give procurement advice on this, but having talked to some procurement lawyers, their view is that there are procurement law issues with just even a temporary extension to get some extra time to bring the contract to an end. And it may well require primary legislation. If actually a number of PFI contracts are getting into trouble, they're not going to be ready on the expiry date, and there's a procurement law problem, if they propose to extend them by just a short period to get them over the line. Again, this is one that the government might have to look at again, because I can see this being a problem going forward, but there appears to be a legal problem at the moment with just even doing a very, very short contract extension to get this over the line. Again, as we've noted, the IPA doesn't address how follow-on services should be defined. It is a greenfield solution. It's also PFI projects, as we've noted, can be a bit of a black box in terms of getting information which the public authority needs to actually plan what the services are going to look like post-expiry. Again, I've largely covered some of these. I've largely covered some of these points, so I don't want to dwell on them, especially as time is getting close. But it is just highlighting some of the key issues which are involved in just getting information. Some projects have already expired, or they've been terminated early. And the lessons learned, it can be very difficult and time-consuming to get the data necessary. Handback provisions were drafted 20 years ago, and so might be hard, or if not near impossible, to interpret. And the interaction between assets and services is complex. And so alignment between asset survey and procurement activities needs to be thought through very carefully. I'm going to end with a direct quote from the IPA. The expiry phase will require a similar intensity of relationship interaction to that required in the PFI procurement and construction phases, or in the implementation of major contract variations. In other words, expect a similar level of intensity to what everybody experienced at the front end when they were trying to close these contracts or do major variations. If we look at the expiry profile and we look at the size of the PFI industry as it is currently configured, I think we can see automatically there is a problem in delivering this. The industry is simply not, it's contracted considerably as PFI has gone out of favour, yet it is going to have to expand massively to deliver this programme. And so I think there will be a really big struggle and a bit of a fight to secure good advisors when the time comes. I think we're going to hand over now to questions. I hope I haven't scared you too much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. Fascinating stuff, as expected with PFI, PPP, a lot of complexity and a lot of complication in what may have been something that wasn't thought about too deeply at the time, the return of the assets. So we have some questions. We have, looking at this, I think I'll take 5 questions, albeit 4 and 5 are related. So if I just go through those, Mark. So the first question that we have is, how can the market resource and reskill as the PFI expiry process is way in excess of current market capacity? I think you've kind of touched upon that a little bit.
I think that's one of the key issues, and there isn't a magic solution to it. Obviously, government can't direct labour, so I think it's going to have to be what I would call a free market expansion of here is what is effectively, and it's a very good way to think of it in terms of career. Here is a 20 to 30 year pipeline, which is going to be very, very busy. Unless government changes its mind, it has to happen. It is pretty much recession proof. Something has to happen. It could be a very, very good thing to get into. One of the challenges, of course, is an awful lot of people who did the deals back 20, 30 years ago have retired. I was very, very young at the time, but an awful lot of people I've worked with have retired. So an awful lot of the skills have been lost. So the industry is going to have to reskill, and PFI is complicated. I would say for a PFI lawyer, it takes about 4 years to train one, just because you've got to know something about everything. You've got to understand banking documents, shareholder documents, project agreements, construction contracts, employment, property. You have to understand everything because everything is relevant. And so I think getting the skill set is, you might get the bodies, but whether you get the skill set is another matter. And I think if people are thinking, well, I'll just call Joe Bloggs, Joe Bloggs may be astonishingly busy, as might other people in the market, and you've got a fixed expiry date, and that gives you a problem.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Some more questions coming in. So the next question, will PFI projects in practice have to be extended despite the government's guidance? I think, as you put in your seminar, the end is the end. Do you think that in reality there will be a need for this extension, whether through a deed of variation or some other means?
The government's position is clear at the moment. The end is the end. Whether government changes its policy, as I alluded to in the talk, I think there's 2 points. There's we like our PFI project and we don't want to do anything different. Can we extend it, please? And currently that is not policy. There is then the short form extensions, which are just needed because you might need a couple of extra months to get it over the line. At the moment, as I've alluded, there's a public policy objection to the first one and probably a procurement law objection to both of them. But my concern is that when we looked at that expiry profile at the start, if 50 projects are expiring, and there's 2 years when you've got 50 a year, it's 104 projects, about 100 projects over the course of 2 years. I find it at the moment, and unless an awful lot of preparation's been done, I'm worried about whether that in practice can be delivered, and there will have to be some form of extension because it's simply undeliverable. But we aren't there yet. And that's currently not policy. I think we need to dig down into the procurement law side of this, because if there's an easy procurement solution, then you can extend in the short term to get your deal over the line. But that's going to be in the hands of the procurement lawyers as to whether there is something there that does not involve primary legislation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. A question on disputes, so closer to my heart. So the question asks, what potential do you see for construction disputes arising out of this PFI expiry process?
I think, as we've alluded to, the key ones are going to be over asset condition. And what condition should the assets be in? What's the handover process? I'm on university projects at the moment in light of, because university accommodation projects follow the PFI model. Even though there's no new PFI projects, there's plenty of new projects in the market which follow a PFI model, like waste deals and like student accommodation projects. And at the moment, I'm poring over the handback and expiry clauses in light of all of this. And it brings out a number of issues. What condition should the assets be in? And the market is kind of coming up with Rick's condition B, but there might be nothing in the original project agreement on that. Who's conducting the surveys? Midlife in the project, who's producing the schedule of program maintenance? Well, it's project company, but who signs off on it? Is it an independent certifier or is it the authority? And then you get to the expiry works plans. Who's procuring that? Who's paying for it? It's a handback program is going to have to be produced. Who produces that? Who signs off on it? Is it an independent certifier, or it does an independent certifier says, yeah, this meets the contract, this meets the contract standards, or is it the public authority who basically says we want to decide that? And then you do another survey right at the end to see whether the works that you identified that should have been done, to see whether they have been done. And again, what's the survey process? What's the sign-off process? Is it, again, an independent certifier's judgment that's final on whether works that should have been done have been done? Or does the public sector want to retain some discretion to say, for my asset, I want the final say in this? So what we're doing at the moment in terms of implementing all of this in modern forms of PFI projects, although they're not, is that we're now sort of teasing out all of those issues which we can foresee that were not foreseen 20 to 30 years ago. So I've just given you an indication there of the kind of arguments that people could be having that get them involved in a dispute. And as the IPA recommends, don't be afraid to go to dispute. If going to dispute is the only way to establish if it's the only way to establish certainty.
Indeed, thank you, Mark. And I'm reminded of the complexity of the dispute resolution mechanisms often used in PFI, PP contracts, and perhaps quite timely for our viewers, a recent case, Children's Arc against Kojima, which is in relation to a tiered dispute resolution mechanism and the ability to commence proceedings and, as it were, leapfrog those. So often there is that mechanism, and it can be the case that it's a condition precedent to go through that process before you get to a final dispute resolution mechanism. So one to be aware of. Okay, a question, two questions, but linked, I think, in relation to termination. So, question is this: is it possible to terminate some parts of a PFI deal early and set up new contracts? Question mark. Or does it all need to happen at the same time? And then, I think a related question: in practice, would a termination team, inverted commas, be funded from the unitary charge being reduced?
I'll answer the last question first. If there is no contractual right to fund the termination team through the unitary charge, and I would be amazed if that was ever thought up 30 years ago, then if there isn't a contractual right to do it, it's going to have to be a public sector expense to build up its own team. Could you just remind me the first question again, please? Yeah,
is it possible to terminate some parts of a PFI deal early and set up new contracts?
The answer is yes, it is, and there are two options there. There would be that normally there is a voluntary termination right, which the authority has to terminate the whole contract, but it is phenomenally expensive to do because basically, in very, very simple terms, debt will have to be paid off because the funders will have lent money to fund the initial construction of the project, and also equity investors will have put equity and sub-debt in. They will have lent that to fund the project. There will be a payment reprofile for that to be repaid across, say, 20 odd years. And the authority is basically going to have to pay that early. So it's going to have to find an awful lot of money in order to effectively buy the debt off and get the project back. There are some contracts that might have partial termination. But if you've got a funder involved, that's going to be quite complex because funders are going to be all over a partial termination. Because if you have a partial termination, then less revenue is coming in, and if less revenue is coming in, how is the funder's debt paid back? If funders have gone, it makes it a lot easier. But I have been involved. I've been involved in two projects that have expired early. One was Metronet. That was about 20 odd years ago. And that was a PPP to refurbish the London Underground. It failed for various reasons. It failed. But basically, and there was another one I did, which was a voluntary termination. It was another London Underground project, and it involved, I think it involved power supply. And I think the London Underground effectively, or whoever the contracting authority was, did buy that out. But it did involve paying off all the debt, and it's expensive. So the answer is yes, you can get your project back early, but it's expensive.
And I'm reminded again, termination seems to be in fashion in the courts. A recent decision, 7th of October this year, Optimairs against Qatar Airways. An interesting and fascinating read about termination at will provisions, good faith provisions, and breaches all wrapped up. And again, PFI contracts often have good faith provisions in as well. So an interesting read. So the final question, Mark, is this: there are some PFIs that have already exited their concession at the expiry. What lessons have been learned from these?
I think we covered that in the talk, which and the primary one was the closer the I'm happy to repeat it, of course. The closer they get to the expiry, the more worried the government gets when it's marking their homework. And so it did produce. I think there is. I'll see if I can just find the slide that deals with the lessons learned aspect of it. But there were 4 principal lessons learned. So it was a lack of understanding of how the projects work, access to information, getting people with the right skills to give advice, and an understanding of the expiry process and the expected asset condition. So those are the 4 lessons learned. There's an interesting point in expiry that I want to make, because when we're talking about exiting early, what happens on an early exit usually is that, as we've noted, it's the debt that's got rid of, but the supply chain remains intact. So on Metronet, there was a default. They got rid of the private sector, they got rid of the SPV. Equity lost all its money, but the supply chain still existed to do the refurb work on London Underground. What happens with expiry is you lose your supply chain, because the project agreement terminates and the building maintenance contract, FM contract, terminates. So you lose your supply chain. You basically lose the party that's been maintaining your asset, and that is a key difference between projects which have may have expired early, or there's been a voluntary termination, and so terminated early, compared to ones which actually expire. It's the expiry issue is losing your building contractor because their contract expires.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, and that concludes our questions. And I see that we are just 3 minutes over the hour, so appropriate to wrap up. So our next webinar is on the 7th of December, entitled Perspectives on the Building Safety Act 6 months on. So another topical subject matter, and we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. We'd also like to plug our construction and engineering blog, Practical Completion, which is a useful repository of helpful hints and tips and practical guidance. So do feel free to dip into that. And do connect on our M&R Construction and Engineering LinkedIn group. So the last thing is, thank you all very much for joining us today. If you would like to contact us, our details are on the final slide. There you go. And thanks in particular to Mark, our speaker, for covering what is a thoroughly dense subject matter in, if I may say, a very interested and light and understandable way. So thank you, Mark, and thank you all. Good evening and goodbye.